People today often imagine the time of Jesus as a purely spiritual setting. Sandals on dusty roads, quiet sermons, miracles unfolding in a distant sacred past. But for the people who actually lived there, daily life was not defined by theology. It was defined by money, or more precisely by the constant absence of it. The world into which Jesus was born was shaped by one of the most unequal economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever produced. A system so unforgiving that a single bad season could erase an entire family's future. Welcome to Hidden Pages. This is where money, power, and history collide, and where nothing is ever as simple as it looks. At the beginning of the 1st century, Judea existed inside the Roman Empire. Not as a partner, but as a resource. Rome did not conquer territories to integrate them. It conquered them to fund the center. Provinces existed to move wealth outward. Grain, silver, labor. Flowing from the edges of the empire toward Rome itself. Judea was one of those edges, and that mattered because Judea was not wealthy. It was largely rural, agricultural, fragile. Most people lived off small plots of land, just enough to survive. There was no surplus, no buffer. A bad harvest didn't mean lower profits. It meant hunger. And Rome didn't care. Rome governed Judea through local elites and imperial officials. Kings like Herod the Great ruled with Roman approval. After his death, Roman prefects took direct control. Their task wasn't to improve living standards. It wasn't to encourage growth. Their job was simple: keep order and make sure revenue kept flowing. Taxes were the backbone of the system. In Judea, taxes were owed regardless of outcome. Land taxes, produce taxes, head taxes, tolls on roads and markets. On top of that came religious taxes. Miss a payment, and the consequences were immediate. There was no appeals process, no safety net. Tax collection was outsourced to local contractors, tax farmers, who paid Rome up front for the right to collect. Anything they extracted beyond that was profit. Abuse wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the incentive. If you couldn't pay, you borrowed. Debt was everywhere. And unlike modern debt, it had no escape routes, no bankruptcy, no restructuring. Land was collateral. One bad year could push a family into a spiral they would never escape. The pattern was predictable. A farmer plants crops. The harvest fails. Taxes are still due. The farmer borrows, often from wealthy landowners or lenders tied to temple elites. Interest accumulates. The following year barely recovers. The debt remains. Eventually the land is seized. The farmer doesn't vanish immediately. He becomes a tenant on what used to be his own property, or a laborer. Over time, many disappear from the records altogether. This wasn't accidental. It was structural. Land consolidated into fewer hands. Large estates replaced small plots. Wealth clustered around elites tied to Roman authority and temple administration. The majority sank into precarity. The economy didn't just produce poverty, it reproduced it. There was no state safety net, no unemployment support, no welfare. Family was the only buffer. Community charity existed, but it was limited. Debt wasn't just financial, it was social. Losing land meant losing status, security, identity. This is the world Jesus was born into, and it's important to be clear. Most people were not poor because they were lazy or immoral. They were poor because the system required them to be. Rome needed surplus. Local elites needed rent. The temple needed revenue. All of that pressure fell on people with the least margin for error. And this produced tension. Judea was not quiet. It was volatile. Rebellions flared constantly. Banditry wasn't just crime. It was economic desperation. Messianic movements didn't arise in comfort. They arose in collapse. This is where modern audiences often miss the point. When people heard sermons about debt forgiveness, they weren't hearing metaphors. They were hearing survival. Forgiveness didn't just mean moral relief. It meant debt cancellation, reset, or escape. And escape was rare. The Roman system was efficient, not humane. It extracted wealth upward with consistency. It tolerated suffering as long as order was maintained. Stability mattered more than fairness. Revenue mattered more than lives. People worked harder and fell further behind. Productivity didn't translate into security. Everyone knew it. There was no illusion the system was fair, only endurance, resentment, and hope that something might break the cycle. And that hope is where ideas become dangerous. By the time Jesus begins speaking publicly, the pressure is already unbearable. The audience is primed. The desperation is rational. This isn't background, it's the engine. To understand why the economy of Judea felt so inescapable, you have to look at the institution people believed was meant to protect them, the temple. The temple wasn't just religious. Economically, it was one of the most powerful institutions in the region. It functioned as a treasury, a bank, a tax authority. Every adult Jewish male was required to pay a yearly temple tax. It had to be paid in a specific silver coin. That meant exchanging currency. Money changers charged fees. Vendors sold animals for sacrifice at approved prices. Religion didn't replace the Roman tax burden. It stacked on top of it. Temple elites were deeply intertwined with Roman authority. High priests were appointed with Roman approval. The institution claiming moral authority also benefited from the same extraction logic impoverishing the population. People noticed. Resentment toward temple authorities was widespread, not because people rejected faith, but because they saw hypocrisy. Access to God required payment. Forgiveness required sacrifice. Sacrifice required money. This is where Jesus speaks directly into the system. When he talks about debt forgiveness, people understand it economically. When he talks about release, they hear relief. And when he speaks about the kingdom of God, they hear an alternative order. Debt, wages, laborers, vineyards. These weren't abstract metaphors. They were daily life. Then comes the moment that changes everything. The disruption in the temple. Overturning the tables of the money changers wasn't symbolic outrage. It was economic confrontation. He wasn't attacking prayer. He was attacking the machinery that monetized access to the sacred. Calling it a den of robbers was precise. This crossed a line. Rome tolerated teachers. It tolerated criticism. It did not tolerate instability. From the authorities' perspective, this wasn't theology. It was risk. Within a generation, rebellion erupted. Jerusalem was besieged. The temple was destroyed. Rome didn't just suppress resistance. It dismantled the infrastructure that made resistance possible. Extraction didn't end. It intensified. Jesus hadn't challenged Rome's ability to extract. He challenged the moral logic that made extraction feel inevitable. Empires can survive suffering. They struggle when people stop believing suffering is necessary. And that's the deeper lesson. Economic systems don't collapse because they're unjust. They collapse when the stories that justify them stop working. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History has answers. I'll show you where to look.